From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I am Ken Davis. Glad to have you back for another week. As you know, on the program, we usually like to talk about corruption, misbehavior, avarice, you know, the kind of stuff that happens at City Hall and down at the Illinois legislature. But this week, we're going to take a break from that. And we're going to talk about avarice and, you know, corruption and misbehavior in the Chicago theater scene. What an interesting difference that is. And it's really a remarkable story. If you were thinking in the next couple of weeks, maybe you were going to, you know, take a jaunt up to Uptown and go see Village Bike up at the Profiles Theater, you wouldn't be able to see it because the author of the play withdrew her support and said that the theater company couldn't produce it anymore. And that was bad enough news until yesterday when they said that after 30 years, Profiles Theater was actually closing. It is an amazing story, and it has to do with journalism, and it has to do with these people right here who are from the Chicago Reader. Robin Amer's back. You were here a few weeks ago talking about a story you did, and now we got you back on something else again. She's the news editor over at the Chicago Reader. And Aimee Levitt is here, one of the co-authors of a massive story about the theater and about the theater scene in Chicago, along with Christopher Piat. Aimee, welcome to the show for the first time. Glad to have you here. You know, we only have a half an hour, and it takes over an hour to read your article.
It takes that long, really?
Well, it took me that long. I did it twice, and I know both times it took me about, because I'm taking notes and stuff, but still, it is a beautifully written and documented piece, and something that you guys should be very proud of.
Thank you.
And something that we always like to talk about here, which is journalism, actually doing journalism. I love that. So anyway, to the extent that it's possible to cram this into our little 28-minute show, Aimee, can you just give us a kind of a bill of particulars about the incredible things that you discovered about this theater?
Oh, where to begin?
Where does one begin? Well, maybe I can give you a hand.
Okay.
The theater's been around for a long time.
Yeah, 28 years.
They have a kind of a, what would we say, what would you call it? They have a style of shows that they do.
It's a kind of a rough aesthetic. It's called the Chicago style. It's kind of violent and gritty.
And their motto is whatever the truth requires.
Yes.
And sometimes it requires a lot.
Yes, it does. They put a lot of demands on the actors. There was the artistic director, well, he was actually the co-artistic director, Darryl W. Cox, who was mostly the guiding spirit of this theater. He acted and directed in almost every show they did. And some of the actors allege that he abused them on stage. He physically attacked them. He psychologically abused them, sexually abused them. And this went on for years and years and years.
So the obvious follow-up question is, how could that happen?
Well, the Profiles was a non-equity theater for a long time. That's non-union. And the union has all kinds of protections for actors. If you have a problem, you can go to your union representative and say, well, you know what, they didn't do the fight choreography, which is to make a fight look like a fight. Mm-hmm. Instead, he actually hit me. But you can't do that in a non-equity theater. There are no rules or anything like that. So, and this happens, we've been hearing since the story came out, it's been happening a lot. And so people were afraid to speak up. And you know, you're a young actor and you're in Chicago and you want to start your career. And then there's Darryl Cox, who is very powerful, and he has this theater behind him, and they win all kinds of awards. They get praise from all the critics, and you're saying, this is a bad place to work, and people are saying, but look at him, and then, who are you? And just people, sometimes they just left Chicago. They never talked about it. Yeah. They were so ashamed and afraid.
And we're basically talking here about young people, or at least younger people, right?
Some
who
of them
are just
old,
beginning their careers.
Some of them are older. There were a few more experienced equity actors that did not want their names used in the story because they were still afraid of repercussions.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously the audience wants to know, if they haven't read this, what kinds of abuse are we talking about here? Physical abuse?
Yes.
Well, for starters, the production that we focused on at the beginning of the story was a 2010 production of a play called Killer Joe. And this
big deal show for them.
Right. It was a very big deal for them. They got a lot of accolades for this show, and the text of the play calls for a certain level of violence between the principal characters in the play. And Profiles Theater did hire a professional choreography firm to choreograph these fight scenes. For example, the script calls for the lead male actor seeming to choke one of the female leads. But what we found in our investigation was that the established professional choreography that was intended to protect the actors was thrown out after the choreography firm left. And so the fight scenes that appeared to the critics and to the audiences to just be choreographed and fake were in fact real. That the bruises on the arms of the lead actress, Summer Benson, who's one of the sources in our story, those bruises were real. The choking of her was real. When you saw one of the actors get slammed against a refrigerator on set, that was real. So the protections that were supposed to exist for these actors really broke down. And a point that Aimee made early on when we were working on this story that I've come back to since we've published is that there's a kind of sacred compact between actors and their audiences, right? We feel comfortable going to the theater and watching these performances because we know in the back of our minds it isn't real.
It's fantasy.
Right.
Yeah.
But to suddenly be told, no, this woman actually is getting beaten up on stage, she actually is being harmed. In fact, she's so traumatized that after the performance every night she can't speak. It breaks down that compact, and it, in a way, even makes the audience unknowingly complicit in the violence that's being perpetrated on these actors. And I don't think any of us who live in the Chicago, who love the theater, nobody wants that. Nobody wants to feel like they've been made to be complicit in the harm that's been foisted on these people on stage.
And to make things even worse in a weird sort of way, the lead actor, the guy who is doing the abusing on stage, he's like everything in the theater. It's his theater, basically, right? So who do you complain to?
And to answer your question of why was this able to continue happening, well, the lead actor of the performance was also oftentimes the director, and when he wasn't the director, he was still the co-artistic director, and there was no independent board of directors. So if you're looking to appeal to people higher up in the organization to say there's something bad happening, there was nobody to go to here. There was nobody independent in the theater who wasn't in some ways either alleged to have been abusing people or alleged to have been complicit in that abuse in some way.
Is that a normal structure in smaller theaters, that there's no, I always thought every theater, but they're a not-for-profit company, they would have to have a board, but...
I think most of them do. Daryl Cox was the president of the board of Profiles, and Joe Yourhouse, his co-artistic director, was the secretary.
And so they were the only route of appeal if you had a problem of some kind.
The stage manager for Killer Joe told us she would try to speak up to the director, who was an outsider, and she says he just brushed off all her concerns and said, no, don't worry about it, or you're overstepping your boundaries. This doesn't concern you.
And if I remember correctly, the director of that production, Rick Snyder, did not comment for
he
our
did
story.
not.
So we don't know what his side of that is.
Rick Snyder was not a regular at Profiles. He was a guest.
He was a guest artist, they called him. He did co-teach the advanced scene study class that the theater offered.
I want to talk about that later on too, but while we're at this point, and also it needs to be pointed out that there's in many of their plays a good deal of nudity, right? And that raises a number of issues of its own about how you manage nudity when you're doing a live theater production. So that kind of adds another layer of complication to this, I suppose.
Yeah, and one of the complicated things about this story is that, we think that at base it's a story about protecting non-equity theater professionals in Chicago and elsewhere. But the thing about what was happening in Profiles is that, you had a powerful artistic director and lead actor who was pursuing romantic relationships with many women who came through the front door as actors and actresses. And that made this story very complicated because there was the personal and the professional bled together. So you had women who were actresses who were starring in these productions, who were also oftentimes in romantic relationships with the artistic director. And so whatever was happening in their personal domestic relationship was bleeding onto the stage and vice versa.
And also, Daryl, his people say, did not have really good boundaries between his character and who he was in real life. Every play he took on, he'd take on some of those characteristics in real life.
Well, there's a great example that the name escapes me right now, but a case of an actor who was in Dark House, I think it was, performance.
Dark House.
In
a dark house.
And got into sort of a personal spat with him about something, and then even though it's not in the script, all of a sudden there's a fight scene on the stage, and he's pushing him and shoving him around. I mean, that's that is amazing.
It is. It doesn't happen.
You wouldn't see that probably at Steppenwolf or something like that. I'm guessing. But the thing that really kind of grabs me about this is the fact that a lot of people were very familiar with this theater. They had an audience, and they had an audience because of the rawness of it and the sort of the grittiness of it. And some of that has to do with the fact that these were shows where there was violence, there was nudity, there was this kind of really raw exposure of the actors, and I guess that had an audience. And I don't know, what is the degree to which an actor or an actress coming into the front door of the theater and auditioning knows that this is kind of the reputation of the theater? Do people know that when they're getting into it?
It was whispered. People would write things on bathroom walls. Actresses would say, "Don't go there." They would tell each other. There's a network.
But again, we need to distinguish between subject matter that's written into a script, that is performed in a way that is fake, right? That is not real.
Right.
People aren't getting raped. They're not getting murdered. They're not getting beaten up on stage. And what is alleged to have happened at Profiles, namely that a lot of the things that were supposed to appear fake on stage were real. So that's an important distinction, right? So you may be an actress who enjoys or is drawn to gritty subject matter, but I don't think anybody went in thinking, I really want to get beaten up on stage. I really want to get...
Obviously, they had no idea. And I guess you don't really find that out until you're in a little bit too deep. Huh?
Right.
What happens is they can't believe that it's happening.
Yeah.
And then you think, wait, the actors say, well, maybe I'm wrong.
Maybe this is just me. Maybe I'm being too sensitive about this
And
or
then
something.
they're isolated from the rest of the cast.
Can anybody talk about Tracy Letts? Because Tracy Letts obviously is a big deal in this town. He's produced Broadway, he's done everything that can be done. This was in his earlier part of his career that he wrote Killer Joe, right?
It was his first play, I think.
Was it his first play?
It was in Steppenwolf in 2003.
Killer Joe was in Steppenwolf?
Yes, that's where it started. Michael Shannon was in it.
Oh, no, I didn't understand that. I thought that this premiered at Profiles.
No, Profiles was a revival.
Oh, it was. Okay, all right. But it has all those hallmarks of a Tracy Letts play. I mean, as we say, it's a pretty raw thing. So did he go and see the production? Did he raise any questions? It would seem to me that if I had written this play, especially if it was my first play and it was now, I know, in revival, I'd be pretty interested to know how it was going, and if I saw this, and wouldn't I ask, wait a minute, that looks a little bit too real even for me. I mean, what is the role of the playwright in this?
The playwrights, we heard from one of the playwrights, Vern Thiessen. He had one play performed in 2007 called Apple, and he said he only saw one performance. And Neil LaBute, I think he said in the Tribune this morning that he was not very involved either. And Profiles did almost all his plays. So the playwrights are not very involved at all. They give their rights and that's it.
Yeah, we don't have any indication that they were complicit in this in any way or even knew what was happening behind the scenes.
I wasn't implying complicity. I'm just curious about just the just the ego of it. You've got a play that's running, that's your play, and I don't know. Well, anyway,
from what I understand, it was during the national tour of August Osage County, and they were doing the production for the movie version of Killer Joe. Yeah. So Tracy Letts was kind of busy.
He was busy. Yeah. So there's another aspect of it that I think that ties in some way to the news, and it's these Profiles classes which I find just an interesting parallel, if you will, to Donald Trump, Trump University. I mean, it's sort of like, well, you can tell us how this works, but someone comes and says they want to audition for a show. They don't get the part, but somebody calls them up and gives them high pressure pitch to come to our theater and take acting classes for $300 or $400 or whatever it is. And at some point, some really big high muckety muck from Steppenwolf or somewhere will be here to, just like you'll get a chance to meet Donald Trump. It's that kind of thing. This seems like just really bizarre to me.
Yes, it does.
To you too, I hope.
Yes, Performing, they ran the ads, and after the story ran, they said, "We will never run any pay-to-play classes ever." I mean, it's it's sleazy.
I'm kind of left a little bit gobsmacked by the whole idea. I mean, this is a theater that obviously didn't have a lot of money. They didn't make much money, apparently. I know you looked into the finances. They never made a lot of money in all their time. But it seems like this was probably a bigger income source for them than the box office was at some points. They had a lot of people go through there.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I think the thing that's really interesting to me about the classes is that, one, this was unorthodox, right? From other people we talked to in the theater community, this is not typical of the way theaters recruit people for classes. It does have—
They charge you.
It does have a bit of appearance of a bait and switch. An actress who commented on the story on social media after it was published said that she felt a little hoodwinked because she had essentially applied for a job there, right, as an actress, and was instead asked to pay them to take this class. But again, these were often young people who either were new to theater or new to Chicago, weren't familiar with the status quo, didn't know that this was unusual, didn't know that they were potentially going to be taken advantage of, and who really were ambitious and wanted to be part of the community and to be seen. And we should say that the person who was advertised as being the reviewer for the final workshop was Erica Daniels from Steppenwolf, and she is a very powerful and well-known figure in the community. And so there were definitely people drawn to those classes, not just because of profiles, but because they wanted to be seen by the casting director of Steppenwolf.
That's who
and so
she
that
was.
Yes.
Yeah,
so that was a very attractive
Yeah.
proposition for a lot of young people who were trying to make it in Chicago, who were trying to be seen, trying to like climb that ladder and become the next Michael Shannon or whatever.
The woman to whom you referred earlier, Summer Benson, right, who is really kind of emerged as one of the heroes in this whole thing because she has laid her story bare for everyone to see. She came in that way, right? Yeah. She came in through the acting classes or whatever you call these things, and she ended up with an 8-year career at the place.
Yes.
But
she also is severely traumatized by her experiences there.
Yeah, as one would think. And then there's the whole issue of, there are a bunch of quotes that I think are just kind of interesting about, well, it has to do with the complicity of the theater critics community, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's just this kind of general obvious thing. I just pulled a quote from the article. It was very hard to believe that the critics that supported profiles didn't know what was going on. Like, at the very least, how hard is it to notice that every time you go to a profile show, you're watching a misogynistic, predatory story involving Cox, who is always the lead actor, and a youngster du jour, which led us to believe that these critics were on Team Cox. It seemed like these critics were so supportive of Cox and profiles that there could be repercussions for reaching out, either legally or professionally. It felt like a potentially career-ending move.
Yeah, so we should, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's clear. That was from a separate post by Christopher Pyatt,
right,
who co-wrote the story.
I should mention that. I forgot to mention that. That was your co-author. And he wrote a very, I thought, a very incisive piece about this topic, about the critics and that.
Yeah, so for context, Christopher Pyatt, who's the co-author of this story, was the theater editor at Time Out Chicago from 2005 to 2009, and he reviewed dozens of, well, maybe not dozens, but a lot of Profiles plays during that time.
He really admired Profiles.
And he was the one who brought this story to our attention. He was the first one on our team to be made aware of this kind of whisper campaign that was happening in the shadows, people who were afraid to speak out publicly about what they had witnessed or suffered at profiles. And when he first started looking into this, he talked to an actress named Sue Redman, who's quoted in our story, and what you read was Sue's email to Christopher explaining why, as far back as 2011, a group of women who had concerns about the theater reached out to Seattle-based sex advice columnist Dan Savage and Oprah Winfrey, asking them for help, rather than go to, say, Chris Jones at the Tribune or Hetty Weiss at the Sun-Times, or even him directly at Time Out, because they were afraid, and they thought, you know, this is the establishment. These people review Profiles plays. They love Daryl Cox. They love the theater. They've given the productions rave reviews. And if we go to them, they won't believe us. They won't take us seriously. So Sue sent that email to Dan Savage in 2011, 3 years before Christopher ever started looking into this story. And I think he especially was really heartbroken to realize that the community of actors and actresses who say that they had been abused there were too afraid to go to the theater critics in Chicago for help because they didn't trust them.
3 years earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, he also, now this is, I think, in his own voice, right, where he says, as the former theater editor for Time Out, I had been one of those critics who loudly praised some of the lurid, sexist, shock-jock melodramas Profiles produced over the years. Reading Redman's explanation was devastating. It made me fully grasp my own boneheaded complicity in the story. A very strong statement from somebody. Now,
I think this really weighed on him for a long time. I mean, once he started to hear about what had happened, he did feel complicit. Now, whether or not that's justified, I mean, I think, you know, we spoke to Chris Jones for this story, and I think, you know, and he told us that he had no idea that this was happening behind the scenes. I don't have any reason to disbelieve that. I think it just shows in a way how this alleged misconduct was happening in plain sight, right? That one would think that by looking at the subject matter of the plays that it would be quote unquote obvious, but it wasn't at all.
Nobody believes the victims. I mean, look at what happened with the Stanford case a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's
you
always,
have to fight and fight and fight for anyone to believe you.
Right. And then, I mean, there were also, weren't there outreaches to Martha Levy at some point too, at Steppenwolf?
Allie, one of the young actresses.
Oh, she's a teenager. I mean, there's a story right there. Here's a teenager who walks in, and there's a play where a predatory old man has a teenage girlfriend. Oh, surprise, surprise, right? And she gets the part, and
yeah, she was in 3 shows there, and then
a company member.
Yeah, she was a company member, and then at the end, he said all these harassing things to her, and then at the end, the relationship, it turned romantic, and then it got abusive, and she left, and then she wanted to do something about it. She wanted to protect women. She went to her agent, and her agent said, well, I can't do anything, but why don't you tell somebody in power? So she wrote an email to Erica Daniels and Martha Levy.
Erica Daniels was also the person who was working for the little Trump University deal, too.
I think she'd left by then.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
And we spoke to both Erica Daniels and Martha Levy, and they confirmed that they did receive Allie's email and that they met to discuss what, if anything, they could do about it. And they told us that they felt hamstrung by the fact that Allie didn't want to come forward and use her real name with her allegations, and Martha Levy told us if Allie had wanted to come forward and use her full name and go public with the allegations, I would have stood behind her, but because she didn't, I felt like there was nothing I could do. And, you know, I think we felt it was important to document the efforts that these women had made to get somebody in the community to take their allegations seriously, but again, the point of going into all that is just, when something bad happens, who do you go to? Who can you trust? Right. If you can't go to the company, the head of the company, if you can't go to the board of directors, if you can't go to the critics, who do you go to? I mean, it's no accident that they went to 3 women in the scene that they perceived as being in positions of power, because who else could they trust? Who could they go to for help? They didn't know.
And there's even, I'm sorry.
And then the women didn't help either.
All right. I mean, there's even I'm sorry, the woman, my mind just blanked, the woman.
Allie.
Didn't she say that she actually never heard back from them?
Nope, she never heard back. She tried emailing Joe Yourhouse, the co-artistic director.
Yeah.
She contacted him through Facebook, actually, and she saw that he'd read it, because Facebook has that little thing.
So it leads me to the obvious question to which I know there can be no answer, but Is there more of this? I mean,
Oh,
is this the
yes.
only theater where this kind of stuff is going on? There
God,
are lots
no.
and lots of these tiny storefront theaters in
We've
Chicago.
gotten so many stories since the story came out. We had an email at the bottom of the story called at tips@chicagoreader.com. We've gotten so many stories since then.
Yeah, for anybody who is watching this, we have set up an email tip line. The email address is tips@chicagoreader.com, and we've encouraged anybody who has dealt with any similar cases of abuse or misconduct in Chicago theater to reach out to us. We have heard from a lot of people, and I think we're figuring out what to do with that information.
What I find really distressing about this is that there's so much of it at the top, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the inappropriate relationships and everything else. But hidden just below that is a whole other order of magnitude of things like, crew members being told to take scenery down when they know the fire marshal is coming, which to me says that they were violating fire codes and on top of everything else, they were putting me in danger if I went to their theater.
They were making the interns work without goggles.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell them about the Profiles Way
Oh,
part
yes.
of the story?
Yes, we talked to a former tech director who said he and his former coworkers who worked at Profiles, they would say, there's a Profiles Way. If you're working, close your eyes because you don't have goggles.
Yeah. I really enjoy small theater in Chicago, always have. I go to a fair amount of it, and I must tell you that very often when I'm sitting in these tiny theaters, I'm looking around and I'm looking at the sprinkler systems and these wooden risers that we're all sitting on and thinking, boy, it would take just one quick flash fire and this would be. But I shouldn't say that. I don't want to be alarmist about it, because I'm sure, I have faith that these places are being properly inspected.
It's part of the compact between audience and theater.
Isn't it though? Right.
You don't see anyone beat up on stage.
Right.
You are not in danger of dying as you sit there.
Exactly that. It's the compact, because it's like, I mean, that's exactly what it is. You're sitting there and you're saying to yourself, wow, this is unbelievably realistic. This is great. But it's something else.
In the past few days, I've heard from people who saw that Killer Joe performance or production, and they said it just seemed off to them. It just seemed so real.
And we should say that there is a silver lining to all this, and that is the efforts to protect theater professionals that we document in the second half of the story. There is a group in Chicago that came out of the concerns around Profiles Theater called Not in Our House, primarily started by a trio of women who had no direct experience with profiles themselves, and in fact had been warned to stay away from profiles, but who kept hearing these whispers about things that were going wrong at the theater. And I mean, they were eventually the people who said, enough is enough, we have to do something. And they have a draft of a code of conduct that they're proposing for non-equity theaters that's based on the Actors Equity Code of Conduct, to say, here's what you're entitled to as far as protections, here's what you're responsible for as a theater, here's who you go to if something goes wrong. Right. And we're starting to see, as a result of our story, a lot of people, not just in Chicago, but nationally, pay a lot of attention to this proposed non-equity code of conduct. We've had people reach out to us to say, I'm going to teach this code of conduct in my theater class. So I'm hoping that if anything comes out of this story, it will be that protections for non-equity actors become more widespread here and elsewhere.
And that's where we have to stop. I'm so sorry. We just totally ate up all our time.
Oh, really? Wow.
Reader, Chicago Reader. Go to the Chicago Reader website. You can read the story, and there's lots more, and there will be much, much more. So I want to thank Aimee Levitt and Robin Amer for being here today. Thank you so much. We're out of time. We'll see you next week with another show. I'm Ken Davis. Here you can go watch the show anytime you want at this address. Okay, thanks. Bye.